Are you curious about the lunch favorites we've left behind from the 1920s? It's time to take a delicious bite out of history and find out if the Roaring Twenties truly knew how to lunch in style. Here are 25 memorable meals that should have never been abandoned after the decade ended. Fried green tomatoes are pretty much synonymous with the flavors of the South. Their place in the 1920s landscape of American cuisine is actually severely interesting. Why? Because it shows you early signs of so much of what dominated America later on. Vibrant immigrant communities, cultural appreciation, the seeds being planted for what would later become fusion food, and more too. Fried green tomatoes are actually a big part of Midwestern and Northeastern cooking styles. They were a regular presence in cookbooks across the nation. A lot of these cookbooks would take inspiration from the many Jewish communities present in America at the time. There were a lot of economic and political factors that made people want to take a peek in their neighbor's kitchen, but it was the fact that people saw real value in what they were cooking that made them adopt it into the mainstream. Southern-style cooking in the 1920s was pretty much dominated by how resourceful you were. Green tomatoes were such an efficient harvest that almost everyone would grow, because it would be the first crop before winter. So, another part of the 1920s was the Prohibition, and that actually has a lot to do with liver pâtés. Our next item was propelled up to the top of the leaderboard thanks to this nationwide ban on all things alcoholic. Besides the obvious implications, who else do you think woke up and really lost it when they heard about this? Fine dining restaurants. See, a big part of their game plan was to entice people with more money than they knew what to do with to their restaurant with fancy wines and drinks. Once the government made sure nobody was getting their drink on, they had to come up with other ways. After all, you got to keep business going, don't you? These new ways meant a lot of additions to pre-existing menus, and liver pats were a result of that. They picked this dish specifically because of the extremely vibrant texture and seasoning. It was the perfect thing to offer to people who were looking for an exotic or high-quality dining experience, something they could brag about at home, or something that really made them look dignified and cultured. The 1920s were pretty much a terrible time for everyone's wallets, but restaurants managed to keep themselves afloat by offering up dishes like this to the very upper class. So steak and kidney pie had a bit of a rough ride throughout the 1920s. This is pretty much right from the deepest trenches of British culture. It's something that any bloke from Europe would easily recognize, and it's definitely celebrated there. Unfortunately, the same can't really be said about the United States. When the first few waves of British immigrants came to America and started settling down, especially in places like New England, that was pretty much the only haven for this recipe. The rest of the country looked down upon it. It's not really that it tastes bad or feels weird to eat. It's a good, nutritious, protein-heavy plate. It's just that it's paired with steak, and steak is something Americans associate with good cuts of meat. In general, most people here are pretty much used to soft, tender cuts of meat and don't eat any other organs. Liver pâtés were something that only the rich played around with. The rest of the country wouldn't really ever try to explore any other parts of animals. Tongues, kidneys, livers, etc. were pretty unpopular. So, fried chicken livers are kind of what I mean. Again, the working and middle classes weren't really fond of stuff like this. Sure, you had parts of the Jewish diaspora and other immigrant communities that would go all in, literally. I mean, they wouldn't waste any part of the animal. Your average Joe from Virginia or South Dakota wouldn't vibe very well with it, though. That was definitely the norm during the start of the 1920s, but I really can't even begin to describe how much of a 360 this took around the tail end of the 1920s. That's because of all the economic pressure and rationing efforts making sure that people couldn't ever get the kind of meat they wanted. Still, you can keep a man away from his family, but never meat. People had to have it in some way, which is exactly what happened during the end of the 1920s. People started to take notes from all the different communities that were present in America. They realized there was just a lot more bang for your buck if you sucked it up and used other parts of the animal too. And so, the horizons of your average Joe expanded past thighs, legs, wings, and breasts. Every decade has its trends, and consumption isn't different at all. This time around, Americans decided to dip their toes into French haute cuisine and see what's what. There, they found out the beauty of chilled, gelatin-based dishes like jellied consomme. It was a pretty big element of upscale dining and of restaurants that were trying to cope with the effects of the Prohibition. Since people needed some reason to go out and come, it had to be a good one. That's also doubly true since back then it was really in style to host parties at home. A lot of these hosts would try their best at European cuisine to impress their guests. Everyone's gotta hit a little flex once in a while to feel good about themselves, and impressing the crowd with a French dish is always a safe bet. Plus, the ingredients weren't really that hard to get. It was more so nailing the texture of the gelatin itself. Luckily, there were enough people around like Chef Auguste Escoffier. If you aren't sure who that is, the man is a very well-regarded French chef who is very famous for his work with gelatin-based dishes. People wanted to get in on the fun, and the trend took off pretty naturally thanks to all these factors. It was actually a lot more in style to experiment with different animals too, not just their parts. To that end, people started hunting all kinds of things when their wallets would really dry up. Hey, you can't judge. For one, Welsh rabbits are delicious. Two, they're also free, assuming you do the hunting yourself. If you go out for a dining experience and aim to order this off the menu though, you're looking at a pretty costly dinner. Welsh rabbits were more or less considered delicacies back in the day. Their extravagant flavor was something that made people come from all sorts of corners just to see if the hype was really there. The tenderness of the meat was like finding out there's a new side of the world we haven't been to before. For all intents and purposes, that pretty much is what it was. It's a lot more common these days to eat rabbits and view them as a part of fine dining, but that wasn't the case in the 1920s. Back then, the seeds for people's current perception of rabbits were being planted. This shift in perception wasn't just about taste, it was also about necessity. The 1920s were a time when economic hardships often forced creativity in the kitchen, and rabbits were a practical option. So, now that we've gone over how the traditional outlooks on food were changing, it's time to talk about a bit of an uncomfortable subject. Tongue sandwiches, and yes, you heard me right, were pretty divisive. It wasn't common for people to go that deep into the whole nose-to-tail style of eating where you'd consume everything the animal had to offer. Tongue sandwiches were seen as gross, strange, and unfamiliar to a lot of people. On the flip side, there was definitely an equally large group that thought this was amazing, particularly Jewish and German American communities. In both their cultures, it was common to experiment around with all the different ways you could incorporate tongue. Also, things changed thanks to the rise of deli culture. A lot of delis were finding their footing during this decade and seeing what works for them, and delis as a whole were starting to become something that Americanas associated with dining, socializing, and just being a hub for people to gather at. That meant that tongue sandwiches finally had a platform to show themselves off on. I think they'd have died out pretty early if not for that, but even still, they definitely weren't making anyone's top 10. Towards the end of the 1920s, the economy pretty much went to the crapper. This meant that people's saviors soon became the crops they could most easily grow. Potatoes, naturally, were at the top of that list. One of the most common things to make with potatoes was potato soup with cheese. This was right before the Depression and the war period, before you start asking how people could afford cheese. It was also cheap cheese, not the grandest wheel right from the factories of Italy. Potato soup was one of the best things to make because it was loaded with carbs, which meant a lot of energy, and it could feed just about your entire family. What did that mean? It meant that from the rural areas on the outskirts of big states and cities to the most well-off neighborhoods, short of just downright filthy rich ones, this was all people were eating for lunch. It became so common to make potato soup that it was all over cookbooks, and even the government was encouraging people to get more into potato-based dishes. It also led to people realizing that they could do a lot more with this crop than they originally thought. So the 1920s was, before all these money problems, actually known for its impact and focus on fine dining. Parsley and celery bisque was a highlight of that entire cultural shift. It was another thing we got from the French, as so much of our fine dining is, but it was glorious. The thing about this time period was that it was pretty much the era of formal dinners and elegant cooking. there was this entire entertainment aspect that was now attached to food, especially the entire restaurant experience. Places had to consider things like presentation a lot more than they were used to. Luxurious-looking dishes were favored, and there was a push to find new and innovative ways to cook meals. This bisque got as popular as it did because it required pretty much nothing. Parsnips and celery were very much easy-to-get ingredients, and bisques weren't the hardest thing in the world to make. Still, it was a walled-off dish. What I mean when I say that is, it was something you'd only really find in urban areas with fine dining setups and restaurants. Places like New York, Chicago, and the rest. That doesn't really speak for a large portion of the rest of the country, because they had very different ideas on how to use parsley and celery. When I say jelly-topped meatloaf, I really need you to keep listening and not skip 30 seconds forward. See, what I mean when I say jelly is really just an aspic that was mixed with seasonings and designed to complement meatloafs. So, really, this might be worth your while. ITW is a practical dish that helped people stretch out their supply of meat in a time where it was becoming just a little bit harder to keep the pantry full each year. Some people definitely didn't respond to it lightly, though. A lot of them actually thought it was stepping on the toes of American culture because, well, where would you ever hear about jelly on top of meatloaf? Breadcrumbs? Sure. Cheese? Definitely. Jelly? That's bordering pineapple pizza levels of treason. Americans are a lot more reactionary than you'd realize, though, and when they eventually did get around to trying it with an open mind, they started to appreciate the dish. Don't get me wrong, though, a lot of people still had some pretty strong and permanent opinions on it. Pickled pig feet are exactly what they sound like. I'm not talking about some obscure pagan ritual lost to time. This was an actual dish that people made and consumed. Pigs' feet were first cleaned and then boiled so that they could be some semblance of tenderness, and then they were mixed with all kinds of spices. Who was eating this? Why? Was it safe to? All valid questions, my friend. Despite the stigma, pickled pig feet gained a loyal following among those who appreciated bold flavors and resourceful cooking. Some even used the gelatin-rich broth to create savory jellied dishes. Pickled pig's feet had a lot of working-class appeal in times like 1928. They weren't expensive at all, and they were even seen as a comfort food in rural areas. In the South, a big part of their culture was using every part of an animal, especially pigs. In urban areas, they became a common staple of delis and were often served with things like sausages and eggs. There was also a stigma around them from people who had more refined tastes, claiming that it was pretty dirty food that shouldn't be eaten. Who cares what snobs have to say, though? Still, they definitely faded out of popularity when things settled down economically and people could afford leaner meats all around the country. So, we aren't done with the pork parade yet. Next on our list is chitlins, or otherwise known as pig intestines. You might be wondering where this one comes from, and the answer's a dark one. It's a part of one of the worst bits of American history. Back when slavery hadn't been abolished and was common, the worst parts of a pig were often given to enslaved African Americans. Naturally, this history made it a lot more than a meal to people who were living in America and eating these. Eventually, it was reclaimed thanks to the efforts of so many African Americans, but not many are aware of its roots. While at first they went from being a low-class food that was looked down upon to something that was a pretty celebrated part of African American culture, there were people in urban areas that thought differently. Funnily enough, it was always these people who would come running to other communities to teach them how to cook more resourcefully when the economy really went to hell. But chitlins aren't just about history. They've got personality too. Love them or hate them. You can't deny that, if prepared well, they pack a punch of flavor that will either win you over or send you running for the hills. They're the kind of dish that spark debates at the lunch table, with folks swapping stories about whose grandma made the best chitlins or who had the misfortune of walking into the kitchen before they were cleaned properly. If you head on over to New Orleans, even today, you'll find a strong love of oyster loaf in the area. This is because there's such a vivid Creole cuisine presence in New Orleans, and nothing says Creole like oyster loaf. In the 1920s, though, it was thanks to the economy booming early on. Oyster became a popular meal in urban areas, and it was served regularly in places like San Francisco, New York City, and Washington. Basically, if the place was bougie, there was a pretty good chance you'd find oyster loaf there. Why get with this dish, though? Well, oyster loaf was a lot more refreshing than your typical old sandwiches. It had new tastes, an unfamiliar texture, and the sauces and seasonings built for it weren't really similar to anything Americans were having. All of this made it interesting, and the best way to market a new dish is to have it raise some eyebrows. Props where they're due, the presentation was also pretty amazing. If you went over to a bar during Prohibition, though you'd never really find a place with alcohol, at least not legally, you'd find a lot of places selling their take on oyster loaves. Give it a few years and you end up with a mainstay of urban eating in America. Ginger cakes were pretty much an old-school classic. It's something you would always expect whenever you drove down to Grandma's, and for good reason. Nothing really puts you in a warm, wholesome mood like ginger cakes do. Especially when it's the holiday season, these are pretty much perfect for the holidays because of their warm flavors and incredibly fluffy texture. I don't need to spend any time on introducing you guys to the wonders of a ginger cake, so let's talk about their place in society for a second. Back in the 1920s, despite how the economy faced a pretty neat little boom early on, that moment didn't last long. It became harder and harder to make elaborate, flashy desserts that really stole the show and everyone's attention. On the other hand, that meant that people were sticking to their reliable recipes a lot more often. Ginger cakes happened to be one of them, and they were extremely accessible. Not just ingredients-wise or with baking. A lot of cookbooks had many different ginger cake recipes, which made the dish itself open to a wide variety of people. You didn't need to be familiar with baking because you had an instruction manual on how to prepare the best ginger cake ready with you. Deviled tongues were another highlight of the 1920s that we don't talk about enough. It's really interesting to see how far the general culture in America has shifted away from offal-based dishes. Beef tongue used to be such a common pick for working class and lower middle class people. It was one of the cheapest cuts of meat you could find, but it did take a lot of work to prepare. The deviling process was pretty intricate, and it took some real skill. You might be wondering where this started from, though, because it's not like people were eating tongues in the 1800s, at least, not to my knowledge. Well, as globalization kept going on strong, our exposure to European cooking kept increasing. The end result was pretty much things like this becoming more and more common. People loved it for its unique spice blend involving paprika and bay leaves, as well as for being a popular choice at all kinds of speakeasies. These were social hubs for people to gather during the Depression, and they often had things like oyster loaves, deviled tongues, and pig's feet. It was a wildly different time from now, that's for sure. So this is probably the most jarring one out of all of them. Crispy pig's ears. Yep, we've got feet, intestines, and now ears on the list. I'd say that's pretty inclusive, wouldn't you? You probably can already guess, but this dish never made it to the big leagues or to everyone's table. It was kind of this niche dish that was just eaten in a few places. One thing about it was that it was probably one of the few times the American South and all of the country's other European communities managed to agree on something. It was pretty much exclusively European immigrants that brought this on over from their cities and cuisines. In the South, you'd see some bars that were low-key serving this. People really liked the crunch of it and thought that it was very flavorful. Of course, that wasn't really a widely held opinion. They were seen as a lot of work, too, since the ears needed to be cleaned really, really precisely and then boiled. You wouldn't want to catch a case of anything. All that combined pretty much ensured that they wouldn't see daylight past the 1920s. Shad roe was a really good seasonal dish that saw a lot of fan favoritism in the 1920s. It was celebrated thoroughly across the East. So, the seasonal part comes from the migration patterns of the American shad fish. These fishes were known for their springtime travels upstream in most rivers. That would mean that catching them was easier than ever, and something people delighted in doing anyway. Back in the 1920s, fishing was easily 10 times more popular than it is today. The spawning season was always something people would wait for with a lot of excitement, especially if you were living anywhere with a coast or a river. It has deep roots in Native American cuisine too, and that's pretty much where a lot of recipes for shad roe originate from. The ease of prep made this a pretty accessible item for middle-class and working-class people. You could pan-fry it, poach it, or just sauté it. It needed a lot of attention to detail and a sensitive touch though, because you could just rupture the roe sacks if you weren't careful. In mid-Atlanta and New England, this dish got so popular that not a lot of people really had trouble with cooking it. If we go on over to the Brown Hotel in Louisville, we'll find a pretty treasured part of American cooking. The Darby Hot Brown was made right there in the heart of Kentucky. Whether you think of this as a comfort food or just something you eat around Derby Day, nobody can deny how good a hot brown is. In the Brown Hotel, Chef Fred K. Schmidt first developed the recipe as an alternative to ham and egg. It was used to serve the guests. A lot of people got pretty tuckered out after spending their evening with all the entertainment there, so this sandwich really brought some energy back. It featured toasted bread, a deliciously rich Mornay sauce, cheese that had been shredded delicately to perfection, crispy bacon, and turkey slices. All of this would typically be broiled to really seal in the flavor. We can't thank him now, but Fred really stumbled on gold with this recipe. Sandwich fans across the nation are better off for it, and I doubt he knew he was making history when he first came up with it. Were you ever a fan of Darby Hot Browns? So the thing with roasted squab in the 1920s was pretty much as good as luxury dining got. It blended in the subtlety of European cooking with the explosiveness of American flavor. It was pretty labor-intensive in that you really needed to farm for it. This kind of made squab a pretty niche product that was inaccessible to middle-class and lower-class Americans. Food production eventually got better though, and it made things like this a bit more available. To the people who could get it though, such as the pretty well-loaded neighborhoods of New York and Chicago, it was pretty much the best thing you could get. Lots of upscale dining joints would serve this as the star of their show, a centerpiece dish in name, looks, and taste. What people really came for was the roasting technique. It would be marinated first, then seasoned with herbs and aromatics, then roasted until it had perfectly golden, crispy skin. The sauces and reductions that people would serve with it, or the wine-based gravies, also really put this dish in a league of its own. All in all, it's definitely one of the best parts of fine dining in the 1920s, and a recipe that would easily hold up today too. Stuffed prunes were a pretty good appetizer that was decently popular in the 1920s. It was one of the easiest things to grow, and it also had some health benefits. Well, at least some legitimate ones. There was a lot of folklore around them that basically would imply that they would help relieve digestion issues. I'm not really sure how true that is, so if any of you have experiences like that, please do share them down below. Anyway, back to stuffed prunes. On their own, they were a little bland, but with vegetable stuffings, they'd actually make a wonderful breakfast. Stuffed prunes also saw variations with sweet fillings like cream cheese or nuts, which added a decadent twist to their earthy flavor. Their versatility made them a hit across different social gatherings. Some people didn't see them as a breakfast item, though. They were also known for being amazing starters at parties. Besides that, they were one of the cheapest foods to grow, so that definitely added to their ever-growing popularity. Unfortunately, people kind of let go of them as the years passed by and people's tastes changed. Tiny taco bites replaced stuffed prunes soon enough. After the appetizers would end, the next thing people would move on to was salmon mousse cups. These were pretty good for what they were worth. People really thought they added this nice air of extravagance to the party. Plus, it was conversational food, like the type of thing you could eat while talking to your friends at any kind of event. It wasn't just parties either. Salmon mousse cups were pretty much one of the best entrees to order at restaurants and cafes, too. They were a bigger go-to for people living in coastal cities, since they were pretty accustomed to the taste of salmon anyway. For some people, the new taste was pretty strange and kind of unwelcome. Salmon mousse cups were also celebrated for their versatility. They could be served in delicate pastry shells, on crisp cucumber rounds, or even as a standalone dish elegantly piped into glass cups. Presentation was everything, and these cups became a symbol of culinary sophistication. Meanwhile, in coastal cities, chefs competed to craft the most innovative versions, adding unique spices or garnishes to set their creations apart. This innovation made salmon mousse cups a staple at high-end venues and a conversation starter for foodies across the nation. Whether loved or loathed, they undeniably made an impact on the culinary landscape of the era. Mousse cups on their own were good enough, so what's the need to fix a clock that's not broken? A lot of people also thought they were a breath of fresh air that shook up the boredom people were experiencing from typical menus. So by the 1920s, there was a lot of attention being drawn to shredded wheat casseroles. This started all the way in the early 1900s, like the past decade. It was basically the rise of processed food growing in popularity. That also happened thanks to shredded wheat cereal, which was the critically acclaimed brainchild of Henry Perky. People weren't too used to wheat in their diets, but a good cereal was a pretty effective icebreaker. Once the love for it was there, though, it was pretty much cemented thanks to shredded wheat casserole. Not only was this an amazing dish in its own right, it was also way cheaper to make than meat casseroles were. You might get tired of hearing this, but the range of things that slowly started becoming unavailable really weren't easy to summarize. By the 1930s, it was rare for people to eat meat even semi-regularly. Shredded wheat casserole was close enough to the feeling of the real thing, but different enough flavor-wise that it worked. People enjoyed being able to eat a casserole for cheap. It wasn't going to replace the real thing anytime soon, but it was close enough. Towards 1929, when the Depression properly started, there was a change in recipes and dynamics. Suddenly, potato donuts were something you'd see a lot more regularly than normal donuts. People either didn't have enough oil or they just didn't have the ingredients for making proper donuts. Thanks to that, people needed to really work on alternatives. Potatoes were already some of the best and most popular crops to grow, thanks to how easy and adaptable they were. Putting two and two together from there wasn't really hard to do. Potato donuts held their weight in their own right, a lot better than the other substitutes people used for classic dishes. Most people got pretty adept at making them. Over time, the difference between a regular donut and a potato donut started becoming more and more vague. There were also all kinds of stores popping up in the 1920s, like the Donut Corporation of America. It isn't like donuts really needed any marketing or PR work, but they were getting even more popular than they used to be. Potato donuts became such a hit that they even started to become pretty common in bakeries and donut shops. Now, donuts are still as popular as they used to be, but potato donuts fizzled out over the years. People just loved the classic flour-based ones a lot more. The 1920s was a big, pretty experimentation period. By now, French culture was sinking its hook deep into the masses. One of the biggest examples of that is how popular cream soup started to become. Cream of mushroom, cream of beef, and even cream of asparagus eventually. People were going crazy for these new kinds of soups, which were incredibly enticing. Before this, people's idea of soup was runny, watery, and just mixed with vegetables. Basically, nothing that would inspire you to get up and grab a bowl, especially if you were on the younger side. Now that all changed thanks to the frugal nature of the end of the 1920s, but before that, people were really getting into cream of asparagus soup. It was seen as a pretty accessible and tasty dish, and a wonderful excuse to get some greens into people's diets, especially children, who were especially lured in by the creamy aspect. To spice it up just a little more, people would mix in little bits of bacon and ham in there too. Later on, it became really hard to get cream, but while it was around, it was an amazing time. Macaroni and cheese with tuna emerged as another budget-friendly lunch that delivered a unique taste to people. Inspired by tuna noodle casseroles, this dish was a seafood take on the classic macaroni and cheese. All people had to do was buy cheap canned tuna from the market and combine it with homemade macaroni and cheese. And in a few minutes, you had a filling meal. Considering seafood prices were roaring during the early 1940s and 1950s, tuna macaroni and cheese was adopted by people as a favorable lunch alternative to seafood items restaurants were serving. Soon enough, lunch tables across the states were using canned tuna as the main protein that enhanced the taste of their macaroni and cheese. Eventually, the food started losing fans as fresh seafood became cheaper in the States due to increased production. This led to a negative impact on the sales of canned tuna, and so tuna macaroni and cheese vanished from family tables. Lunchables were launched in 1988 by Oscar Mayer, a brand owned by Kraft Foods, aimed at simplifying school lunch preparation for busy parents while appealing to children with fun, customizable options. Originally conceived during a company brainstorming session, the idea was to create a product that could use the brand's existing meat products in a novel way. The initial Lunchables kit featured crackers, processed cheese, and sliced meats, and could be assembled into miniature sandwiches, mimicking the action of building with blocks, which resonated well with children. Over the years, Lunchables expanded to include various themes like pizzas and tacos. The marketing campaigns for Lunchables focused heavily on fun and convenience, successfully capturing the interest of both parents and children. The packaging also evolved from simple plastic trays to more vibrant and engaging designs that featured games and trivia, enhancing the appeal. These kits not only changed the way food is packaged, but also influenced children's lunch habits by providing a fun and interactive way to enjoy their midday meal. Tuna salad has managed to stand the test of time pretty well, and it gets even more simple than ham salad does. It is great that grandmas back then were always around to shatter misconceptions around how salad is an incredibly bland and boring concept. The ways they made these salads would get even the most stubborn, protein-only diehard on the bandwagon. You would be surprised what onion, celery, some spices, and mayo can do to tuna. It is an incredible comfort food classic, and it works with freshly caught tuna or canned tuna. Back in the 1900s, basic dressings were most commonly used, but towards the late 90s, stuff like Dijon dressings also got really popular, and they only made it healthier because you would find it much easier to eat an extra bowl or two. Which do you prefer if you remember growing up with this? Pickled pig feet might make you cringe right now, but they were quite the lunch in the southern USA. Simply put, the lunch was a plate full of pig feet that had been pickled in vinegar and spices. Some might have eaten pickled pig feet as part of larger meals like soups or stews, but it was not uncommon for people to snack on them as it is. Historically, pig's feet used to be considered an upper-class delicacy, but with the commercialization of processed food, pickled pig feet became available at local supermarkets. This opened the delicacy up to several people who had never thought of such a lunch existing. Though pig feet remained a staple lunch in southern states, it was inferred that the taste was not why people stocked up on the food, rather it was because they were sold for cheap in markets. Children definitely disliked the jelly-like vinegary taste, so it makes sense that the food started vanishing from shops during the 2000s as fewer people bought pickled pig feet. Bacon cheddar potato skins epitomize the fusion of simple ingredients into a beloved American bar snack. This dish, which emerged prominently in the culinary scene during the 1970s, utilizes russet potatoes known for their thick skin and starchy content, making them ideal for baking and frying. The preparation involves halving the potatoes and scooping out most of the flesh, leaving about a 1/4 inch attached to the skin. The hollowed-out skins are then baked or deep-fried until crisp and golden. Once crisped, these skins are stuffed with generous amounts of sharp cheddar cheese and crisp crumbled bacon. The cheddar is chosen for its melting properties and strong flavor, which pairs well with the smoky bacon. The filled skins are then returned to the oven until the cheese melts into a bubbly, golden pool. The dish's widespread popularity helped elevate the status of the potato from a simple side dish to a featured player in the culinary world. So your typical idea of a cake might be a baked delight with flour and frosting, but what about fish cakes, such as crab cakes? They need some love too. Luckily, they have enjoyed their fair share of spotlight in the days of our parents and their parents, and they work in many ways. A nutritional snack to amp up your diet, something to pair up with a good dip and bread or other seafood, or just a delicious meal all over for munching on. Grandmas would always get to work on making their best fish cake with just simple ingredients like breadcrumbs and crab meat, and the fresher the crustacean, the better the cooking. These crab cakes made the rounds pretty regularly in places like Maryland and Ohio or Mississippi, where fishing for crabs was really common. Yet another sandwich made using cold cuts were head cheese sandwiches. Where the sandwich originated from is unclear. However, food critics trace head cheese or meat jelly back to Europe. Beware, as this cold cut is made from unusual ingredients, including the flesh and meat from the heads of calves or pigs. Yes, that is where head cheese gets the name from. This cold cut is paired with mustard and pickles, then served cold on a slice of bread as a lunch food for those looking for an interesting sandwich. European immigrants brought head cheese with them to America, and much like the liverwurst sandwich, head cheese was not well received by locals. As the meat jelly was introduced in markets, many locals bought it as the price was economical and they could try out a new dish. But the taste was so unlikable that people decided to not make this lunch a regular food, and head cheese was effectively forgotten. Ham and cheese quiche, which gained prominence in American kitchens in the 1970s, is a refined yet simple dish, originating from French cuisine but fully embraced by American bakers. This savory pie combines a flaky pastry crust with a luscious filling of eggs, cream, diced ham, and shredded cheese, often Swiss or cheddar for extra flavor. The quiche is baked until the egg mixture sets into a creamy custard, perfect for slicing. It became popular not just for its delicious taste, but for its adaptability to various dining occasions, from brunches to dinner parties. The dish's versatility extends to the kitchen, where variations might include different types of meat, vegetables, or cheeses, depending on the cook's preference or the ingredients on hand. Moreover, the preparation of quiche contributed to its status as a dish that could be dressed up for guests or scaled down for a simple family meal. So far, we have two solid options for salads with a sandwich variation for one of them, but what if you do not like protein in your salads? Want them on the sweeter, more dessert-y side? Then molded cranberry orange salads have your name written on them wrapped up in a bow. Some normal or raspberry gelatin and frozen cranberries, plus apples and oranges cut into wedges, would make for an incredibly sweet and delightful salad that had everything you wanted in it taste-wise. It also did wonders for your skin with a steady supply of vitamins and the benefits of cranberries. So not only would grandmothers make this for their beloved families, but they would sneak a bowl on the side for themselves too. Despite the ingredients being relatively easy to get, this was more of an upper-class dish popular in affluent areas. Similar to Spam sandwiches, fried luncheon meat sandwiches also used processed meat to create a comforting lunch. Luncheon meat was the name given to cold cuts of meat that included cooked, sliced, deli, and sandwich meats. During World War II, strict rationing of fresh meat prompted the population to find solace in luncheon meats. Necessity led to the creation of a sandwich made with fried slices of luncheon meat, topped with any vegetable or condiment available at the time. Luncheon meats had a long shelf life and required little to no cooking preparation, allowing people to conveniently assemble multiple sandwiches for lunch and keep their bellies full. Ultimately, the sandwich became a part of American cuisines and family diets, which allowed it to be popular even after meat rationing was reduced. Luncheon meat's fame declined only when health concerns were raised in regards to the sodium and fat content in processed meats. The taco salad, which emerged as a popular dish in American cuisine in the 1960s, is a notable example of Tex-Mex culinary fusion. The typical taco salad starts with a crunchy tortilla bowl filled with lettuce, seasoned ground beef, shredded cheese, diced tomatoes, and black olives, finished with dollops of sour cream and salsa. This dish illustrates the adaptability of Mexican cuisine to American tastes, incorporating more cheese and sour cream than traditional Mexican salads. Taco salads became particularly popular in the 1980s, often served at gatherings and potlucks due to their customizable nature, which allowed guests to tailor the toppings to their preferences. Taco salad's popularity also coincided with a growing interest in more casual dining experiences at home, where families and friends could interact in more relaxed settings. You must be pretty used to casseroles both from your mom's hands and your grandma's, but have you ever had a macaroni casserole straight from a veteran home chef of the 20th century? It can really change your view on the whole thing. This throws out all the typical casserole ingredients you might be used to, and you should look at this more like a pasta dish. Egg, milk, and some vegetables take center stage alongside the main star of the show, some classic macaroni. Some meats are used, but sparingly, and in the 1950s, people mostly skipped out on them. A thick layer of melted cheese on top with breadcrumbs and a side of ketchup. What is there not to love about this? It takes the concept of comfort food and cranks it up to 1,000. Yet another sandwich made using cold cuts were head cheese sandwiches. Where the sandwich originated from is unclear, however, food critics trace head cheese or meat jelly back to Europe. Beware, as this cold cut is made from unusual ingredients, including the flesh and meat from the heads of calves or pigs. Yes, that is where head cheese gets the name from. This cold cut is paired with mustard and pickles, then served cold on a slice of bread as a lunch food for those looking for an interesting sandwich. European immigrants brought head cheese with them to America, and much like the liverwurst sandwich, head cheese was not well received by locals. As the meat jelly was introduced in markets, many locals bought it as the price was economical, and they could try out a new dish. But the taste was so unlikable that people decided to not make this lunch a regular food, and head cheese was effectively forgotten. Combining two iconic American fast foods, the cheeseburger and French fries, into one dish, the cheeseburger French fry casserole emerged as a popular meal option in the late 1980s. This casserole layers seasoned ground beef mixed with ketchup, mustard, and chopped onions, topped with a layer of French fries, sprinkled with shredded cheese, and baked until golden and bubbly. Introduced in the kitchens of inventive home cooks during the 1990s, this casserole was a response to a growing interest in recreating fast food favorites at home, offering a fun and fuss-free dinner option that delighted both kids and adults alike. Popularized in American households in the early 1900s, so tender Swiss steak involves a method of preparing a tougher cut of beef, such as round steak, by pounding or rolling before cooking. This tenderizing process, known as Swissing, lends the dish its name, although it has no connection to Switzerland. Traditionally, the steak is browned, then slow-cooked in a rich tomato and onion gravy, allowing the flavors to meld and the meat to become fork tender. This dish showcased an economical approach to cooking during the Great Depression, providing a delicious solution for less desirable cuts of meat. The preparation of Swiss steak often became a Sunday dinner ritual, where its slow cooking could proceed alongside family activities, making it an integral part of the family dining experience. Speaking of much-needed digestive health, apple salads did just that and were a commonly used weapon in the culinary arsenal of parents everywhere. A delectable apple salad with Honeycrisp apples, dried cranberries, some pecans, and grapes would make for a unique salad that could easily serve as an impromptu appetizer for a party or a star on a well-equipped salad bar. A slightly sweetened mayonnaise dressing also did a lot for this dish. And if you did not vibe too much with mayo as a dressing, you could always switch to French or ranch dressings. People used all kinds of apples besides Honeycrisp ones, such as Fuji apples or Braeburn apples or Granny Smith apples. The idea was to commit to some serious trial and error because the small difference in apples meant a lot for the dish. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches were some of the least popular lunches introduced by local shops as a lunch option. Liverwurst was a variant of liver sausages that were cooked and paired with onions served on rye bread. Sounds unappealing, right? Well, that was the general consensus of everyone who ate this food in America. You would wonder why a simple 3-ingredient sandwich did not gain significant traction as a lunch staple, and the answer was easy. Liverwurst had a strong, overpowering taste that did not appease the taste palates of the common man. This was especially common in New York, where local delis started removing liverwurst sandwiches from their menu because of how disliked they were. Today, the sandwich is barely available in any state, and it would be rare to find a home chef cooking liverwurst sandwiches for their lunch tables. Zucchini panzanella salad, an adaptation of the classic Italian bread salad, began to capture the attention of American food enthusiasts in the late 1990s. This version introduces zucchini and robust Italian bread, grilled to perfection, tossed with ripe tomatoes, red onions, and fresh basil, all dressed in a balsamic vinaigrette. The innovation lies not just in the ingredients, but in the method of preparation that emphasizes the grilling of vegetables and bread to enhance their flavors before combining them with the dressing. This approach not only maximizes the textures and flavors, but also aligns with a growing preference for grilled foods. The salad's popularity grew as it became synonymous with summer dining, often featured in outdoor meals and barbecues where a light yet satisfying dish was required. Tuna salad made a fresh comeback, which helped extend its shelf life in the American homemade breakfast or lunch scene. The tuna salad everyone was already pretty accustomed to was reconstructed, this time with seasonal and tropical fruits like apples or cranberries and served in fresh pita sliced in half. Not only was this really healthy, but it was also intensely high in protein and carbs, so it helped you build that all-important muscle while keeping you full until a suitable time in the evening. Cannot give in to those post-meal munchie cravings, right? Tuna salad was great served as is, but some people would go a step further by baking it for a while too. Bologna-like luncheon meat was an affordable cold cut that America loved due to its affordability and customizability. Unlike boring sandwiches, bologna boats were a fun and appealing way to feed children during lunchtime, as the shape of bologna boats attracted younger audiences. What is so appealing about the shape, you might ask? Well, chefs hollowed out bologna slices and shaped them into an oval that would hold ingredients like cheese or relish. The slices were then baked to ensure bologna boats would hold their shape when being consumed. A fun addition lunch across the state eventually became a forgotten lunch, as the preparation time for bologna boats was too time-consuming. Home chefs needed a quick and suitable lunch to make, and bologna boats were not meeting the requirement anymore. As Mediterranean diets gained popularity in the United States for their health benefits, the layered Mediterranean dip emerged as a favored choice for its delectable mix of flavors and healthful attributes. Widely introduced in the 1990s, this dish layers hummus, tzatziki, olives, diced tomatoes, cucumbers, and feta cheese, each layer offering a unique texture and flavor. Though traditionally served with pita chips as an appetizer, this dish also serves beautifully as a substantial lunch option, especially when paired with a fresh salad or grilled vegetables. Its popularity highlights a growing American trend towards dishes that are not only nutritious, but also substantial enough to serve as a main course at casual lunches or gatherings. Croque madames involve layers of melted cheese smothered between freshly baked, crisp white bread. And to top it all off, there's an intense, smoky flavor from the ham. The best part about it is that it takes minutes to make, and it was one of the more fancy dishes that people would create when they were feeling like having a bit of an extravagant dinner. Everyone deserves to treat themselves sometimes, but for home chefs, especially grandparents, the biggest treat is often just seeing everyone eat up every last bite of what they've made. That was never a problem if croque madames were the dish being served, because nobody could resist this classic American sandwich that did more than its fair share of justice to ham. Poached or lightly fried eggs as a topping also made it work a lot better. And by the way, they are called croque madames because the poached eggs seem to resemble women's luxury hats in the 90s. Our list of forgotten lunches would be incomplete without mentioning bean sandwiches. You may not have even heard of this vegetable-based take on sandwiches, but decades ago, bean sandwiches were part of many lunch tables. Home chefs preferred this healthy take on sandwiches, even though cooking beans was a tedious task because you would end up with a flavorful and well-seasoned meal. According to the traditional recipe, the sandwich was cooked beans that were sometimes mashed and served on bread with toppings like vegetables and cheese. Like any other sandwich, the bean sandwich was highly customizable and satisfied just about anyone's cravings. If you had leftover beans from dinner, making a bean sandwich could be your best option. Since people were conscious of leftovers and wanted the most value out of all of their meals, bean sandwiches were a good way to utilize beans. Still, the combination was a little odd, and not a lot of states would pick up this lunch option. As meat delis opened up across the states, bean sandwiches were forgotten to be a thing of the past. Make way for more sandwiches, as sardine sandwiches are next on our list. A fairly easy lunch to cook up, sardine sandwiches used canned sardines that were mashed and mixed with mayonnaise or mustard to create a umami-flavored sandwich spread. Like we previously mentioned, seafood was getting expensive and families needed alternatives like canned fish to survive the lack of seafood options. Home chefs turned towards canned sardines to prepare a delicious sandwich with just a few ingredients that were laying around the house. Surprisingly, the sandwich was well received by the masses, and it became a go-to seafood food that you could cook up during family lunches. Unfortunately, sardine sandwiches suffered the same fate as tuna macaroni and cheese as the prices of fresh fish decreased in the States due to increased fish farming, leading to tinned fish becoming less popular in homes. Corn soufflé presents a refined twist on traditional American ingredients, combining the native sweetness of corn with the airy texture of a classic French soufflé. Introduced into American kitchens primarily in the early 20th century, this dish features corn kernels blended with a mixture of milk, butter, and egg yolks, with stiffly beaten egg whites folded in to give it a light, fluffy consistency. The soufflé is then baked until it rises and turns golden, offering a delicate balance of flavor and texture. The dish highlights the versatility of corn, a staple American crop, by showcasing it in a form that contrasts dramatically with its usual preparations. This adaptation not only speaks to the culinary creativity of the time, but also to the integration of European techniques with American ingredients. So Cobb salad was not actually made by a grandmother on the brink of innovation, but by Bob Cobb, who owned the famous chain of Brown Derby restaurants in LA and Hollywood, California. He made the chopped salad in 1937 and knew that America needed a salad with enough of the familiar stuff it was used to and enough of the healthy things it desperately needed. While they cannot take the credit for making it, grandmas all over the nation still rejoiced in delight when this fantastic dish did hit tables and restaurants all over. They finally had an easy, cheap, and quick way to get some much-needed nutrition into the family diet. All a Cobb salad takes is some boiled eggs, fried tomatoes, chicken, bacon, and other ingredients with a lettuce topping. You might think, why not throw in some spinach or kale, but we will get to some salads that use those too. For this one, lettuce worked the best with the textures of the meat that were in there. You might be familiar with bologna because of its popularity as a deli meat today, but fried bologna sandwiches were in a league of their own back in the 1960s. Categorized as a Southern classic, fried bologna sandwich was brought into the USA by German immigrants. The sandwich was mostly popular as a school lunch, as cafeterias would serve up hot fried bologna slices on bread with cheese to students during lunch hour. While school lunches had a reputation for being average food, the fried bologna sandwich was exempted from such notions. Children loved when fried bologna was on the school cafeteria menu, and parents were happy that their children were finally content with their school lunches. Fried bologna sandwiches remained a popular lunch choice until schools shifted to foods that could be cooked in batches instead of sandwiches that had to be individually assembled. Cornbread-topped frijoles blends the heartiness of traditional Mexican beans with the comfort of Southern American cornbread, creating a casserole that is both nourishing and satisfying. This dish layers seasoned beans, often pintos or black beans, cooked with peppers, onions, and spices, topped with a layer of cornbread batter that bakes into a crusty topping. Originating from a blend of Native American and Mexican cooking techniques, the dish was adapted over time to include a variety of beans and sometimes meat, making each rendition a local specialty. The dish not only satisfies with its rich flavors and textures, but also serves as a practical one-dish meal that could easily feed a family or a gathering. Cornbread-topped frijoles became favored for its economical use of basic pantry staples and its ability to be prepared ahead of time, making it ideal for communal meals and family dinners. This next one is also a fusion of two different classics, so it is kind of a new take on both, just like macaroni casseroles. But have you ever thought about what a meatloaf burger would look like? It's not just something you might think about on a boring Saturday. It's a tried-and-true combo that has been around for ages. People may not know about it on a mainstream level nowadays, but it has been a local top 5 dish in states like Washington, New York, and Arkansas. Everyone in America loves a good meatloaf, and back in the days of our grandparents, it was one of the most common homemade lunches. What was one of the most regularly eaten takeout options? Burgers. Hamburgers, cheeseburgers, double patty behemoths, you name it. People ate it, and eventually they wanted to see what else could be done with the burger format, which works all too well. Lo and behold, the meatloaf burger made a name for itself rather quickly as a very filling and delicious meal to whip up at home. Canned food was seemingly a fan favorite back in the day, as SpaghettiOs are the next forgotten lunch we want to bring back. Campbell Soup Company took notice of the popularity pasta was gaining as a lunch food in the 1960s and invented SpaghettiOs. Sold for cheap in supermarkets, the dish was a basic tomato sauce with circular pasta rings instead of spaghetti noodles. SpaghettiOs were convenient and budget-friendly. Thus, they rapidly became a lunch staple for many people who needed a quick meal. Parents preferred giving their children SpaghettiOs because they were less messy, and children enjoyed the circular shape. Eventually, SpaghettiOs became a forgotten lunch as newer, easy-to-make lunches, like Kraft macaroni and spaghetti, came along. People simply did not enjoy the taste of canned spaghetti and moved on from the iconic SpaghettiOs. Introduced during the late 1980s as American interest in Asian cuisine surged, pineapple ginger chicken stir-fry represents a fusion that captures the essence of both American and Asian tastes. This dish combines juicy, sautéed chicken pieces with sharp ginger and sweet pineapple, delivering a dish that bursts with contrasting flavors. The addition of bell peppers and onions adds a crunchy texture, enhancing the overall sensory experience. The use of ginger, not only for its flavor but also for its reputed health benefits, coincided with a growing American fascination with healthier eating options. It exemplifies how global ingredients were becoming more accessible in local supermarkets, enabling home cooks to explore international recipes with ease. Stuffed potato pancakes are a delight to have on their own, but they go great with any kind of syrup or dip too. And if you had grandkids coming over and did not know what to make, this was a surefire bet. Potatoes have always been a massive staple of American cuisine and culture, partly because they form the basis of many simple, affordable dishes. An example of this is how in the Depression there were several potato-based dishes that people regularly adopted, and they stuck in the cultural landscape of American cooking much longer after the dust from the recession had settled. In states like Ohio, Oregon, and Idaho, it is still common to see potato-centered dishes taking the #1 spot. So imagine the rounds they made back when they were truly in style. Taking a break away from the McDonald's and the Wendy's, stuffed potato pancakes usually have bits of meat stuffed in them like sausages, pork, or ground beef. And it is not only packed with flavor but a great dish to eat if you are looking to bulk up too. Grandma does know best, after all. Corned beef hash with eggs was popularized in the States after World War II when rationing meat was a common practice. One of state's biggest food processing companies, the Hormel Company, claims they bought corned beef hash to America in the 1950s and jump-started the invention of corned beef hash recipes. Since acquiring fresh meat was getting harder in the post-war era, people used corned beef to create a hash lunch. The recipe was simple. All you had to do was dice corned beef, mix it with potatoes and onions, then add a poached or fried egg on top. Corned beef was not really a fan favorite as the peculiar taste did not appeal to many people. This meant that as soon as necessity was not driving people's cooking, they forgot all about corned beef hash with eggs. Crab Louis salad, reputed to have originated on the West Coast in the early 1900s, is a luxurious ensemble of crab meat, hard-boiled eggs, tomatoes, asparagus, and iceberg lettuce, dressed in a creamy sauce made from mayonnaise and chili sauce. This salad is often linked with the dining rooms of San Francisco and Seattle, where it was served as a gourmet item in the early 20th century. The inclusion of Dungeness crab, a regional specialty, underscores the salad's connection to the Pacific Northwest's seafood bounty. Its enduring popularity was fueled by the dish's association with elegance and affluence, making it a prized feature on hotel and restaurant menus. Additionally, Crab Louis salad is a testament to the American culinary tradition of adopting and adapting regional ingredients to create dishes that become part of the national gastronomy. Speaking of wanting to watch your waistline while still feeling you are eating food meant for humans, roast beef finger sandwiches were the go-to for that genre of food because they ticked most boxes nutritionally while also having an explosive and vibrant taste. Something between a mid-work deli sandwich picked up from the corner of the street and an aromatic beef plate with veggies made by your grandmother, roast beef finger sandwiches offered the best of three worlds: size, taste, and health all in one, since they were usually served at brunches or bridal showers in a min sandwich format. Health-wise, they gave you more than just a good dose of protein, and that depended on what you would use as toppings. You could use olives, peppers, or other spices, as well as lettuce, tomatoes, and spinach. How do you prefer your sandwiches to be, mini or otherwise? Moving on, we have the green bean casserole, which makes for a healthy lunch that was often served at holiday dinner. As the name suggests, this dish was a casserole made with green beans, cream of mushroom soup, and a hearty topping of crispy fried onions. Green bean casserole's recipe emerged from the Campbell Soup Company in 1955, which had long been producing canned cream of mushroom soups. They introduced the recipe as a way to increase sales of their newest soup, and this strategy was an instant success. Nearly 40% of their soups were sold to create the green bean casserole in both homes and restaurants. The dish remained a part of Thanksgiving lunches for a long while, before eventually households replaced it with a Thanksgiving casserole that had bits of everything we see on a Thanksgiving table. This festive dish, emerging in American culinary circles in the mid-20th century, cleverly combines the contrasting flavors of sweet pineapple and savory cheese. The pineapple cheese ball consists of cream cheese enriched with finely chopped pineapple, green peppers, and sometimes added ham or pecans, rolled into a ball and coated with crushed nuts. The dish captures the post-war American enthusiasm for novel flavor combinations and party foods that could double as conversation starters. Its popularity at social events can be attributed to both its taste and its decorative appearance, which made it a visually appealing centerpiece on buffet tables. The pineapple cheese ball also illustrates the period's innovation in using canned ingredients, which were celebrated for their convenience and year-round availability, allowing hosts to whip up impressive treats without extensive preparation. Another wonderful appetizer was broiled Parmesan tomatoes, which were ready in about half an hour and were the ideal sidekick for some boiled or fluffy eggs alongside biscuits. Fresh, ripe summer tomatoes, filled with concentrated flavor, topped with an olive oil spray and kosher salt, sound like a really good time, not to mention the main selling point. The Parmesan cheese added so much flavor and style to this that it became a trending option in the mid-90s and was a frequent sight in many cookbooks in the States, especially those aimed at housewives and home chefs. Many of Grandma's broiled Parmesan tomato recipes are available online, showing how they have stood the test of time and continue to be passed down within families. Wiener Schnitzel was the golden ticket to European dining sophistication in the 1920s, especially for anyone trying to impress a date or a dinner party. This Austrian masterpiece is essentially a breaded and fried veal cutlet, thin enough to see your soul through it. It's crispy on the outside, tender on the inside, and came with the whole continental cuisine vibe that felt fancy without breaking the bank. But here's the thing. In the United States, Wiener Schnitzel never quite became the belle of the ball. Sure, it had a moment of fame in immigrant communities, but the broader American palate was still more in love with hearty, gravy-laden meat dishes or the glory of a juicy steak. The idea of flattening a piece of veal and frying it didn't scream comfort food to the masses. And then there's the name Wiener Schnitzel doesn't exactly roll off the tongue like, say, fried chicken. So while it was a culinary marvel in Europe, here in the States, it quietly faded from lunch menus, leaving behind a breadcrumb trail of nostalgia. So what do you say? Should all these nostalgic lunches be brought back from the 1920s? Comment down below and don't forget to like and subscribe.